Daniel chapter 8. Let's look at chapter 8. It's the heading there is the vision of a ram and a goat. So we've studied the first beast, the first kingdom, and we all know by now that it is King Nebuchadnezzar and it is Babylon. So now we just want to look at the successive two kingdoms that came into power, which is described by a ram and a goat. Okay. I'm not going to give much facts on the chapter. However, I just want to bring to your attention that it starts off in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign. Okay, chapter 7 you will see happened or transpired in the 1st year of King Belshazzar's reign. So if we go back into the future, I just want to let you know chapter 5 speaks of King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his noblemen. And if you remember in chapter 5, that was where he was overthrown and he was overpowered by Darius and by Cyrus. At that time, the Medo-Persian kingdom took over. This was the last banquet he had and entertainment they enjoyed before they were overpowered as Babylon. And that's when the Silver Kingdom came into power, and that's when they were overpowered, and King Darius and Cyrus, then the Mede, took over. That was when the Medo-Persian reign started. Daniel is now from chapter 7 taking us back into time. This was when he saw the vision. So King Belshazzar was still alive at that time, which means he was still under Babylonian reign, under the Nebuchadnezzar empire reign. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was king at that time, and so he ruled and reigned. And so he gives us timelines specifically so that we can understand that we are not in the 3rd and 4th kingdoms yet. So he's lived throughout the first reign, the reign of the first kingdom. He's lived now in the 2nd reign of the Medo-Persian, going into the 2nd reign of the Medo-Persian. But the visions he saw was still when he was under Babylonian captivity. Okay. So that is why he begins his letters. Chapter 7 was the 1st year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylonian, when he had those visions. And then chapter 8 brings us up to speed and tells us that it's in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign. So it's still under Babylonian reign, where he now gets to see these visions of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th coming kingdoms that will reign in the future. Okay, so he just wanted to make that clear to us. And so now we understand when we read this, he was still under Babylonian captivity, and he begins to see visions of the future and what is to come. Right. So chapter 8 basically I'm just going to focus on the two kingdoms that it's addressing. It's just focusing on what again the nature of the two kingdoms that will come into reign and power. We know who they are now because it's history to us. So we went back and we studied these kingdoms. We studied these men that came up, so we can identify them. We can put a name and a face to the beast, or name and a face to the ram and the goat now, and we understand based on its descriptions what they would be able to do and how they would conquer the world and the things that they are capable of doing now. If we go back into history, we can identify exactly who that is. The only one we cannot identify is the 4th kingdom, and that is the one that is still to come and rule and reign, which speaks of the 10 toes and the 10 horns. Okay. So Daniel then in chapter 8 verse 3, he looked up, and before him was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and the north and the south. So basically, clearly we can see this ram, this beast, had 2 horns, which speaks of Medo-Persian, the Medes and the Persian combining. And like I've explained before, the Persians were more powerful than the Medes. So there will be a strongest or longest horn in this instance here. He's described to have the longer horn because the Persian Empire was the stronger side. The Medes weren't as strong as they were. Okay. When we look, he says in verse 4, he says, I watched the ram as he charged toward west, north, and south. Remember earlier we said that he took over, that was the 3 ribs in the previous vision that Daniel saw. He described the 3 ribs. So it was the 3 kingdoms he overpowered. He overpowered Babylon, a place called Lydian, and he overpowered Egypt. So that specifically explains about the Medo-Persian invasion and rule and reign over the world. Secondly, we look at the goat. Okay, well, if we just quickly look at the characteristics of the lamb, we know that he was the same as the previous beast. He was as the bear. He was lopsided. The bear was lopsided, right? So in this case, his one horn was long, similar to the bear. It was an unequal union between the Persian Empire. The ram was an important symbol to the Persians. It was their primary god. It was a ram. We will learn that they always used to take a ram's head into war with them because they figured it brings them luck. It was their constellation symbol, meaning Aries is a ram, and the Persians obviously they operated under this belief that the ram is their god and it's their lucky symbol, etc., etc. So that is why we could identify that the ram refers to the Persians or Medo-Persian. Verse 5, he says, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattered his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay. We see that the prominent horn was broken off. We see that at the height of his power, the large horn was broken off, and then in its place 4 prominent horns grew, which refers to the leopard and the 4 heads of the leopard, and then the 4 wings of birds that was on the leopard, right? So that's where we make the similarities when it comes to the two kingdoms. But if we look closer, the thing I want to bring about quickly, when we look at the Greek Empire, right? So this was the Greek Empire. The goat was their ancient symbol. It is the Capricorn symbol. The goat's head is on there. Alexander the Great was the emperor at the time, and he reached world domination within 10 years from the start of his military career. And he ruled and defeated the Near East, Middle East barely in 3 years. He wanted Babylon as his capital city. So he died early in his 30s when he was young. And that's where verse 8 says the goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. So that was Alexander, that he was only 30 years old when he died, history tells us. Okay, so Daniel predicted his early death while he was still in power. It is also said that Alexander actually read the book of Daniel and identified himself to be this 3rd beast, and that is why he acted the way he did, with much power. And he just went conquering and conquering, realizing that Daniel was speaking about him and his kingdom ruling and reigning the world. And so obviously later, the division of his empire ran along compass directions, which was the 4 prominent horns that came up, and those were the 4 generals that started to rule. Okay, but now we continue and we look at verse 9, and it says there, out of one of them came another horn which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. He says it grew until it reached the host of the heaven, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifices from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifices were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, how long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconstructed. Okay, so the interpretation is there for us. But if I can just bring you up to speed when it comes to the history of this horn that came up. So horn obviously speaks of rulers. The 4 rulers was the 4 rulers that came into power when Alexander the Great died. And from those 4 rulers, a little horn came up. So this means that because we are speaking of the 3rd kingdom, we had to look at somebody that fits that description during that time and rule and reign of the 3rd beast, okay, which is Greece. So some of this sounds very familiar when it comes to the little horn coming up, but we have to realize that 4 horns were in power, and the little horn came out from these 4 horns, as opposed to the 10 horns when we look at the previous chapter, and the 10 toes when we made those similarities there. So this is a completely different situation that we're looking at. However, there's a little horn coming up, but which grew in power to the south and east and towards the beautiful land. The beautiful land basically just means Israel. Okay, so it means that obviously this king begins to grow. He overpowered the east, he overpowered the south, and then he went and he conquered Israel. Remember that these 3 kingdoms, or 4 kingdoms, their criteria to fit what is described in Daniel's prophecies has to be that they will dominate the world at the time, they will overpower the previous kingdom, and then thirdly, they will oppress Israel. So Israel will be part of the countries that they will dominate and take into captivity, okay, or will rule and reign over Israel at the time. So that is what we're looking at if we look at the criteria of the kingdoms that will come into power. So not all kingdoms in history fits this description, and that is why we have to be very careful when we interpret what we see in the book of Daniel. Okay, so let's look at this little horn that comes to power now. And if we study, history shows us that a man by the name of Antichist came to power, and he fits this description perfectly, right? So Antichist the fourth fits the description of this little horn perfectly, because he came into power during that time when these 4 horns ruled and reigned the world. Okay, it describes him as such. It said it grew and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. So now I know it might sound supernatural. It probably sounds like something we could read in the book of Revelation, but just pause a little bit. Remember, we're still busy with the 3rd kingdom, the 3rd beast. So let's not jump ahead. Like I said earlier, rules of interpretation needs to apply. So when we look at Genesis 30, so if we look at what the starry host, so we want to interpret this now. We want to interpret this symbol, and we want to try and find out now, how could he throw some of the stars down to the earth and trample on them? He is human, first of all. I know we would all like to think Antichrist, okay, which is okay, but we're not there yet. So he's human, and you obviously ask yourself while interpreting this, what human is able in this time, during this reign of these four kings, or the four horns specifically, has supernatural power to throw starry hosts from the sky? None of them, right? So we rule that out. Starry host could probably mean angels. If we look at the symbol of a star, it means an angel. So we could think that maybe, okay, he was talking about angels, fallen angels. No, we rule that out, because when we look at the context, it obviously just speaks of a human being in control and ruling without supernatural power. Right, so we rule that out. But if we go to Genesis 37, now we try and find, like I said earlier, somewhere in the Bible, places where one of the previous prophets or one of the previous characters in the Bible make mention of stars. Genesis 37 was the one I could come up with, and it speaks there of Joseph who had his dream. Remember, he said that he had a dream. He spoke to his dad and his brothers that the moon and the stars bow down to me. And then Jacob comes, and Jacob just gives the interpretation, and Jacob asks him, shall I, your mother and your brothers bow down to you? So Jacob just gave us the interpretation of stars there. He comes and he says to us, the stars are the sons of Israel. So that is what we have to understand, what Daniel saw now when he said that he threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. He was speaking of the land of Israel, because he goes in and he goes towards the beautiful land, which is Israel. So now he begins to trample on these Israelites, meaning he wages war against them, and he fights against them and conquers Israel. So we continue to say there that it set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifices from him and places his sanctuary. A place of his sanctuary was brought low. Okay, so when we look at that, he says now, okay, so this horn will come, and if we look at the interpretation, if you carry on, verse 23 says, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced kingdom, a master of intrigue, will arise, and he will become very strong, but not by his own power. So that's where we see, when we look at the interpretation brings in a different man with a different character, a different look, and a different sort of supernatural power. All right. So right now we're just looking at Antiochus and what he was capable of doing during his time of reign. So this is where we go back to the history books, and we go and we search Antiochus and his reign during the time, which I think was 170 BC, round about that time. And we find that during that time, in December 168 BC, he seized Jerusalem on a Sabbath day. He was very angry at the Jews at that time. We find that he went in, he defeated the sons of Israel, and this is all history. He killed 40,000 Jews. He took 1,000 into slavery. He conquered Egypt, and then he went and he targeted Rome. I think he flopped in that region. He went back because he was angry, and so he went and he continued to oppress the Israelites. He continued to wage war against them. If you read history, you'll find that he offended the Jews by actually going and he set up a statue of Zeus in the temple. He went and he slaughtered a pig. He sacrificed the pig's blood on the altar, and this was the most horrific thing that the Jewish people saw at that time, that happened in the temple. You can only imagine how they must have felt. It was so horrible that they actually called this event the abomination of desolation. So if you go back to history, you will find that matches exactly what Antiochus did. Okay. You'll also find that if you read and you try and find out what his name means, and he begins to call himself Epiphanes, if I'm saying it correctly, which basically means that he is the manifestation of God. So at that time he was so powerful, and he felt that he had all this power and he could do all these things to mankind. He called himself the manifestation of God. which sounds very, very familiar, but just keep a pause on that. Let's just see where we are going to. So in 171 BC, we find that he removed the daily sacrifices from Israel and from the temple. And if you understand that this was just God's penalty for Israel for disobeying God. Okay, and exactly how he said, how it is written in the book of Daniel 11, that he will take away their daily sacrifices, right? And so that's what Antiochus did. Okay, he continued all this as the word of God teaches us in verse 14 for 2,300 days. If you go back in history, it will be exactly the time when Antiochus came into Israel and took over, rule and reign Israel for 2,300. It says evenings and mornings. That is the Israel calendar. Israel starts their day in the evening at sundown, and their day ends in the morning at sunrise. Okay. In September 9, the Maccabees actually destroyed Antiochus. They managed to come in with full power and with full force. And September 9 in 171 BC, they came and they rededicated the temple. And on 25 December 165 BC, they reinstated the sacrifices, which is everything that God said what will happen took place, and that happened during the reign of Antiochus. But what we need to understand now is, if you understand the Bible, if you understand interpretation and you understand how the author has laid this out for us, there will always be a type of, as a student you should know, or you must have heard of a type of. We see that if we go back into the Old Testament, that Isaac was a type of Christ. He was not the Messiah, but he played out certain roles and characteristics of what the Messiah would be and do if it is his time to come. You will continue to see other characters like Moses being a type of Messiah. And so Joseph is a type of Messiah. And then the same when we're looking at chapter 8, we see a type of the Antichrist. And so when we look at what Antiochus did, similar to the things that the Antichrist will do, similar to the things that he will begin to do in Israel, there will be another desolation of abomination of desolation taking place. He will also place in the book of Revelations, we'll read, he will also place his image to be worshipped in the temple. So Antiochus is just a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist will be able and capable of doing. If you go and you read Daniel's interpretation that he got from Gabriel, okay, Gabriel comes and he says there that, so like we said now, a wicked man with a stern face, the master of intrigue, will arise. Right? He will become very strong, but not by his own power. That already says that it will be a supernatural power, like I said earlier, that will drive him, okay, to his success. And he will succeed in everything that he'll do. He'll destroy mighty men. He'll destroy the holy place. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Okay, so this is where we're looking at what the Antichrist will be capable of doing. So when he stands against the Prince of Princes, we're speaking about a one-on-one battle with Jesus, with the Messiah. Antioch did not do that. Antioch went as far as to destroy and stop sacrifices. He went and, just defiled the temple and did what he did, but that was it. He was stopped in his tracks by the Maccabees. Here we see a foreshadowing of when the Antichrist comes, he will take it further than that. So he will come and he will cause deceit to prosper, which is what Jesus says we must look out. We are in the times of deceit. We must not be deceived. He comes and he says that he will consider himself superior. And then when they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed but not by human power. So this little horn, immediately the interpretation switches over to the little horn, going back to the statue and going back to the previous fourth beast. Okay, the interpretation leads us into the little horn. He will be destroyed, but not by human power. Antioch was destroyed, yes, but he was destroyed by the Maccabees. The Antichrist will be destroyed by a supernatural power, who is Jesus Christ himself, because Jesus wants to take him on personally. And I believe he has the right to do so, and he will destroy him for eternity. It says in verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Okay, it concerns the end times. It concerns a time that is even beyond the time where we are in. Daniel goes and he concludes and he says, I was exhausted. I lay ill for several days. Then I went up and did the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So clearly it is beyond his understanding. When we try and interpret this, it could be beyond some of our understandings as well. But like I tried to explain, Antioch, as the name says, Antioch, Antichrist, is just the foreshadowing and just the type of what the Antichrist will be capable of doing. Just as we had a foreshadow and a type of the Messiah, now we have the opportunity to see what the Antichrist will be capable of doing. But not just that, he will not just be limited to that. He will have the ability to continue to destroy and cause destruction. And that is what's going to happen during that 7-year tribulation period.